and say welcome. Welcome to Festival of Place Bytesize for this talk on green space or white space with Dr. Bridget Snaith. I'm Christine Murray. I'm the editor-in-chief of The Developer. I'm going to say that again. I'm Christine Murray. I'm the editor-in-chief of The Developer. We're a small independent company. We run a podcast and a website. We make a magazine, and we host the annual Festival of Place with the ambition of bringing people together to unpick what makes places worth living in, cities where people thrive. And we connect a community of planners, developers, designers, and academics who value the spaces between the buildings. Our journalism, podcasts, and events like this are free, but if you like what we do, please support us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/thedeveloperuk. Bytesize is a taster, a free taste of our main annual event, the Festival of Place, where our community comes together to learn and meet each other. And our big event this year is on November 13th, so do check that out. It is going ahead. The government has given us some very clear guidelines, and we're really excited about how we're going to create a blended and safe experience for everyone to come together. Luckily, we have a semi-outdoor venue. We're going to be taking all hygiene protocols, and we're going to enable a way for us to learn and socialize and meet and discuss and debate. And actually, we're soliciting ideas about kind of the future of such events at the moment. So look out for that. If you do get a survey across your desk, please do fill it out and help us make this a great experience for you, both physically and digitally, so that we want as many people as possible to be able to take part. So save the date of 13th November and keep in touch about that. I'm so excited to be hosting Dr. Bridget Snaith this morning. We're going to be talking about landscape architecture and public space and green space. And we're already talking about that as part of our campaign that we're running with Will, Sandy, and Vestra at the moment for a radical rethink of public spaces. So if you've got an idea about how we can improve the way we make the spaces between the buildings, we're just asking for a call out for ideas that we can amplify and publicize through upcoming events and publications. It's a simple, no more than 2 sheets of A4, can be an email, can be a 3-line email, and then we can develop that idea with you later and through the course of it. But you have until the end of August to submit that to editorial@thedeveloper.live. And a huge thanks to Vestra for shaping that with us. So this morning talk's going to last for about 30 minutes, and that's going to be followed by a live audience Q&A session. You type your questions as they occur to you in the Q&A, but put your comments and your kind of running chitter chatter in the chat, obviously. And then I will read through the Q&A questions and I'll put them to Bridget afterwards. There is some polls that will pop up, so do participate, and we'll be looking at your answers as part of the talk. We've got 3 polls this morning, and after the talk and Q&A, we'll be sharing links to the breakout sessions in smaller groups where you can digest some of your learning and meet others in a kind of relaxed Zoom atmosphere. So Dr. Bridget Snaith is a chartered landscape architect, urban public realm designer, social researcher, and educator. She is partner in a registered landscape architecture practice called SHAPE in London, where she has lived and worked for 20 years. SHAPE's work is focused on community, public, and third sector clients. The practice is best known for projects with a high degree of community involvement, such as the Playable Street Van Gogh Walk in Stockwell. Bridget's PhD made a case study of the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park to investigate how design is a factor in underrepresentation of people from minority ethnicities in UK parks. And she now advises on equalities, inclusion, and design quality as a built environment expert for the Design Council. She currently leads the program in landscape architecture at the University of East London. So I'm going to hand it over to you to Bridget. I'm going to do my seamless tech thing now. There we go. So good morning, Bridget.
Yeah, thanks very much, Christine. Thanks for the introduction, and really interested and excited to hear that the Festival of Place will go ahead again. The event last year was really interesting and enjoyable, so thanks for managing to organise that. So this morning I'm going to show some slides talking about my work over the last, I guess, 5 years, and I think we're going to do some polls during it, and as Christine says, it should take around 30 minutes, but you know, I've got more than 30 slides, so it might overrun, and we're doing some polls as we go, so hopefully not too bad on the overrunning front. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'm also going to turn off my camera, I think, during the presentation, just because of bandwidth issues. So Yes, so you've had an introduction. My name's Bridget Snaith. I've been a practicing landscape architect. I got my chartership in 1994, so quite a while now that I've been working in practice. And throughout that time, I've been working in community-based landscape architecture. As Christine said, a lot of our work involves engaging with communities and trying to understand what they would like to see in the places where they're going to be spending their time. So I think in the last few months, we've all had to really face some pretty big changes. And one of those is the realization of how important parks are and how they have become even more important to us during the lockdown as places where we can actually get outside, see other people, allow our kids to play. But while we might assume that parks offer everybody equally a space that's open for use, the research that I've been looking at shows that actually park spaces are contested, and that actually people do not have equal access to parks where they live for a variety of reasons. Next slide, please, Christine. So the focus of my work has been around underrepresentation of people who are of color, people who are sometimes known as Black, Asian, and minority ethnicity people. And I think there's a range of terms that I'll probably use through the talk, because the terms that we use are evolving. And obviously, when we're talking about people, you know, we're actually talking about people, so it's not like a kind of an abstract entity. So English Nature have been carrying out a survey every year. They started in 2009, looking at who is using what they call natural environment, but this includes parks and open spaces. So it's not what you might think of as just wildlife areas, but actually all of the kind of horticultural spaces and man-made green spaces. And what they find every year is that children who are from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic households are visiting the natural environment less often. So only 56% visit once a week, compared with 74% of people from white ethnicity. Next slide, please. So there's also, and this is very significant, less green space in areas where there are more residents from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds. And the figures from the mean survey haven't actually factored that in. So understanding how easy it is for people from BAME or disadvantaged backgrounds to access space hasn't actually impacted on how they're understanding their findings. There's also underrepresentation of people of colour in parks across the UK. So you can see evidence of this in studies done by Cape Space in 2010, and also the Heritage Lottery Fund required information from parks as part of their funding packages going into public parks in the UK since the 1990s. What we see is that there's a stronger relationship between patterns of park use and ethnicity than for park use and income alone. So there seems to be a factor around ethnicity or race. And there's also variation in patterns of park use between different ethnic groups, which would seem to indicate that racism is definitely a factor, but it may not be the only factor. And another thing that Cape Space found in their study, or reported in their study, Community Green, is that all of the groups that they spoke to, all of the different people from all the different ethnicities, were found to value parks equally. And so it's not a case perhaps of then people not wanting to go to the park or not thinking that the park's an important part. So just to talk about some of the work that we've done, we found underrepresentation as part of our work in Croydon, where we were doing an equalities impact assessment. And the protected characteristic in the Equalities Act is race. So we were using the census data in terms of sort of racial categories rather than looking at ethnicity, which is a sort of finer grained, more culturally based measure in some ways, in many instances. So what we found there was that even though it was a beautiful hot summer's day and 50% of people in the park catchment are from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds, only, well, 75% of the people in the groups that we spoke to that day were white ethnicity, and less than 1% of the groups that we spoke to claimed Black ethnicities. Now, when I say we spoke to groups, we were walking throughout the park and we were talking to everybody that we could find, and we would talk to one person within a group, and maybe one or two people would fill out surveys, but in general, where we spoke to a group, it could be 8 people or 10 people. And this sort of underrepresentation was really marked and really visible. And next slide, please. So looking at the research that there's been research into this topic in the US in particular, but also in the UK since, well, 1970s, and there's been a variety of explanations that have been put forward. One that's important to reflect on is that culturally normative preferences can vary from group to group, and it isn't necessarily the case that the white pattern of use should be the measure for what people's normative preferences for using parks would be. It might not be an exclusion issue, but what we found and what studies show is that people do feel excluded from space and aren't able to find the places that they would like to use. And as the people that shape space are majority white, it's pretty hard to understand what normative preferences would be if a group was shaping its own spaces. So I think there's certainly a level of that within the findings, but we don't see currently everybody having equal access. Another thought put forward was that because people are living in areas that lack green spaces, that this then becomes normal to them, and that people might get used to not having parks or nature, and that might be the reason that they're not then engaging with nature. But actually, this isn't supported by statistics either. So if you look at the Lee Valley in London, there is a huge amount of ethnic diversity around that London's regional park, but the space is very much white dominated. Or Victoria Park, which sits right in the heart of an area which has a really high population of people from British Bangladeshi backgrounds. And actually British Bangladeshi people are really underrepresented as users of that park. So it's not about the park not being where you live, it's about the fit between you and the park not working quite right. And then there are obviously issues of racism and fear. And as I mentioned earlier, there's variation, there's huge variation, and also there are patterns that are different between people who might, in theory, be subjected to racism at somewhat similar levels, because I'm not sure how greatly racism is differentiated depending on what your ethnic background might be. So there's definitely patterns of difference that are not purely related to that, but all of these factors are important. So one thing that happened from the Olympic Park, which was really clear there, is that different parts of the same park with the same catchment have been found to have very different audience appeal. And so we can see that design does support patterns of use and behavior. And I'm going to talk about some of the data there just to kind of continue from that. Next slide, please, Christine. So I started asking if everybody making the park space, or almost everybody making park space, is white. Are parks actually whiter by design? And I've spoken about my practice. I've mentioned, and Christine mentioned, the PhD study that I did between 2011 and 2015 during the making and opening of the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. And I've also then completed a really large equalities impact assessment and the public engagement strand of a project in Croydon in 2017 for their 6 destination parks, where we had 3,000 participants taking part in the engagement and equalities impact measures. And what we found is that there is evidence of exclusion due to placemakers' cultural preferences, that the preferences are seen as being legitimate, that they are moral, that they are rational, and that other views that are associated with different cultures or religions, or people who don't subscribe to this particular worldview, their views can be trivialized or even denigrated, and might even be expected to be educated out, such that people who don't share the legitimate view need to learn it. So open space professionals are not then reliably providing for people who have different ideals or different social needs. Next slide, please. So in the PhD thesis, I applied a framework from sociology, and this framework was developed by a French sociologist called Pierre Bourdieu. And the key work that I started with was his work called Distinction, which is a social critique of the judgment of taste and describes how cultural consumption provides an outward marker of social position and sustains hierarchies through understanding of taste, for example, in pastimes, in sports, in food. And he describes how people have what he calls a habitus, which is the result of the social context within which they are born, within which they are raised. And this forms their skills, their dispositions, informs preferences, and also is expressed through an embodied identity, through the ways that they speak and use language, and will have conscious and unconscious components. And it influences leisure activities and tastes. The habitus can be changed. You can change the way that but through learning, you can change your embodied identity. You can add to your sphere of knowledge and so forth, and you can learn new skills and understand more about what other people might consider to be good taste. But if you are born within the field, the social context, particularly the powerful social context, then you will already fit. And if you are from outside of the field, then you have to learn to the rules of the game, and it's like being a fish out of water. So the powerful in society, their legitimate tastes are often represented as truths. Sorry, could we go back one, Christine? And the ways that these are, sorry, the ways that the legitimate tastes are enforced, partly through processes of education. So education is a state-sanctioned process which reinforces and validates legitimate knowledge and taste, and it uses institutional and state recognition through award systems like degrees, etc. And the other end of this sort of process of reward is something that Bourdieu calls symbolic violence. And symbolic violence is where it can be actually somebody is being denigrated, their views are ridiculed, or they might, I guess, so for example, people that have been at an architectural school might be familiar with the group crit, where you put your work up on the wall and people kind of will give you feedback and advice. So that can be a formal kind of experience, and sometimes that can be pretty harsh. And that would be what Bourdieu would call symbolic violence. But it can also be microaggressions. It can be things in the neighborhood, people kind of tutting or that sort of thing. So this is how people are kind of shaped by their context, but they also have power as agents to kind of work their way through that. But obviously, within this system, you can see that certain people will have advantage. Okay, next slide, please. So I started to look at what are the legitimate tastes for UK landscape design, and I think one of the key moments that's certainly important in the design of the Olympic Park was the rejection of order and formalism in landscape design in the 18th century, where the English landscape school began to equate liberty in landscape, in organic forms, with liberty in politics, and that the idea was that unspoiled nature, which is actually created artificial landscape space made to look like nature, replaces the formal mockery of princely gardens. And pictured is Vaux-le-Vicomte on a not particularly good day, which was designed by the designer of Versailles. And on the bottom, Stourhead, which is an absolute classic of the picturesque movement. So also around the 18th century, then this idea of the genius of the place, which comes from Roman theories about how the place itself informs what should happen there. And this is a physical rather than a social idea of place. So you can move whole villages as long as you respect the rocky outcrop. There's also, in the 19th century, then the ideas of this sort of English landscape school began to develop into romanticism. There's a way in which rugged and wild places become seen as symbolic of freedom. And within that kind of philosophy, there's an idea that the crowd is not something that you should want to be part of, that man is corrupted by the city, and cities are also corrupters of nature. So you're looking to escape and to find spiritual freedom in wilderness. And then through into the 20th century, as Europe was looking towards exciting modernism and saw production processes as a way potentially of liberating people from work, in England there was a tendency to look back to the rural tradition, to the idea of true England, which was in the village and the cottage garden. And then where we are now in the 21st century, we're looking at a landscape which combines a lot of these ideas with the ecological aesthetic. So that actually brings in the idea, the value of science, that we can actually manage our way sustainably to continue to live the way that we do. The value of science gives it truth, and also then it contains place value because the ecology comes from the place itself, and it engages with romanticism because of the wildflowers. And so all of these sort of stories are entwined in the kind of landscape that you see within the ecological aesthetic in the UK. Next slide, please. And this is just a slide that shows that these kinds of images are part of the hegemony. They're there, we're constantly shown them. And these are all website pages about how nature is good for health. Next slide, please. Okay, so if we see that as the legitimate cultural capital for British landscape, that can then be contrasted with other cultures or subcultures for whom wildflowers can be seen as weedlands that are neglected, dirty, or wasted space. Man in nature is a positive thing. It actually brings bounty and color. And so there isn't a separation between what's good for people and what's good for places. The city can be seen as progressive. It's a place where people can find freedom. It's the center of culture and aspiration. And so actually the city is a positive. Many cultures enjoy sociability and crowds and activity. And the countryside can represent hardship or backwardness or hostility. So within these other ways of seeing place, certain aesthetics will not have the same positive meaning. Next slide, please. So this is a copy of the questionnaire that I used for the survey to try to understand what kind of landscapes people were interested to see. And I asked if all of these parks were within 10 minutes of your house, which do you think you'd want to visit the most? And people were able to select more than one. Next slide, please. So there's just a little note here about the different kind of design styles that I was looking at, but there were also things around paths, footpaths, and presence of seats and presence of people that were found in other people's research to influence design. So what I found here, this is a representation graphically of a difference in preference. On the right-hand side, you can see loose
Bridget, are you there? You've just gone quiet. Hello? Oh dear, we've lost you, Bridget. Can you guys hear me? I'm just going to stop share for a second so that I can let her know to come back again, because that was great. This is a good moment. I don't want to lose her. Let's see.
Hey, Christine, can you hear me
now?
now?
Oh, yeah, you're back. Yes, you're back. Wonderful.
Okay, great. So
okay.
I'm now on. Oh, sorry.
Yes, I'm going to share back again.
Okay, lovely.
Okay, good. Oops.
Okay, great. So what this shape basically shows the difference in findings in terms of preference for people from white British backgrounds and from people who I surveyed that were from Pakistani British backgrounds, Indian British backgrounds, Caribbean British backgrounds, and Bangladeshi British backgrounds. And the biggest difference you can see is the tendency towards the preference for these kind of romantic, loose, picturesque landscapes compared to the more organized, more maintained spaces on the left. Next slide, please. Richmond Park, which was specifically chosen to look a little bit bleak, the image, was the most frequent choice of university graduates and the second most popular choice for all white British respondents. This is university graduates who had white British ethnicity. And it's among the least popular images for all the other groups, in particular British Bangladeshis. And the statistical likelihood, mathematical test of this, that this association wouldn't be found in the wider UK population based on the sample, was less than 1 in a million. So it's really likely that this is something you would see elsewhere. Next slide, please. I also had made an effort to engage with people who had university degrees from a variety of different ethnic backgrounds so that it wouldn't be education alone. And what I found was that actually white British university graduates had very different tastes than white British people who hadn't been to university with regard particularly to the ecological aesthetic. So the marsh and the meadow were very popular with British white people who had been to university, but not at all popular with people who had not. This pattern wasn't seen in British Caribbean participants or British Bangladeshi participants. And the Caribbean name for the group, or the sort of ethnicity, these are people who have a heritage from the Caribbean rather than Black African heritages. So this is a specific ethnicity that's part of the census that was used to kind of try to think about how people might potentially have shared ideas, whereas Africa's a huge continent with many cultures, so it doesn't make sense as a kind of a thought about a cultural experience or anything like that. So that's why specifically that's Caribbean. I saw that come up in the chat. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is an example. Here's an image of the North Park Easter 2014, and you can see on the right-hand side the 3 landscapes that were the most popular for white British university graduates and how similar those landscapes are. Next slide, please. And this is some of the quotes from interviews with park makers and from focus group participants. So there's a contrast here between John Hopkins, who's the client for the Olympic Delivery Authority, and he mentions that this park was not what you might expect for generalissimos with grand boulevards and grand statements. And if you think back to this idea of rejecting formalism as a kind of morality, that's very much embedded in this quote. And he talks about how the commitment to non-human issues is paradoxically making the park more humane, whereas participants in the focus groups who live in areas that look a lot like this say, I did a walk within this river area. I don't do that. As soon as you're over the bridge, I don't do rats. I don't like nature. I don't like walking on grass. I just don't like it, dog poo or mud. And so they're not seeing the same thing in this landscape. Next slide, please. Rowan Moore, who's a critic, talks about the best space being in the more serene North Park, that it's noble. And again, he's kind of referring to a kind of a class-based discussion. And then a participant from Poplar talks about how the image of this particular wildflower meadow, he was reminded of a waste ground where a house had been broken down in his neighborhood, and he really couldn't stand the view. It was just depressing. Next slide, please. And then similarly, another design professional was saying that the quality of the view should be enough, whereas participants in the groups were saying, well, what would I do in the park? There's nothing to do there. Next slide, please. And then looking at the South Park in the Olympic Park in the same, actually the same day, the same weekend, the number of people is very different. Next slide, please. Rowan Moore talked about here that there's a frenzy of wacky light fittings, that the place is like the visual equivalent of several mobile ringtones going off at once. So he's using, I would say, a very class-based, denigrating language to try to put you off liking a place like this. And then a participant from Hackney says, I like to go to the park with a bunch of friends and have a gossip. So she likes a lively space. Next slide, please. The South Park was designed by a different team to the North Park. And the client was ultimately a little disappointed that they weren't able to make more of a sustainable design impact on the South Park. But participants in the area are talking about how they like variety. I know what I feel like when we go with a big group. We're looking for extra activities. We like boating, a nice garden flower area. So it has to be big. So we're all entertained from the oldest to the youngest. Next slide, please. And the impact then of the difference in design is quite marked. So the catchment population around the Olympic Park is 60% people who would be described as being from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds. And 52% of people who were using the South Park between April and September 2014, according to the counts that I was doing, 52% of those people seem to me likely to be claiming a Black, Asian, or minority ethnic background from visual indicators, which is obviously not perfect. But only in the North Park, only 23% of users would, from visual indicators, in my view, be claiming that ethnicity. So Christine, next slide, please. And this is just the same data displayed differently. So the park catchment, the blue area represents the white population. And you can see how overrepresented white people are in the North Park compared to the South Park. And you can see the kind of movement and the kind of general patterns of use within that time frame. Next slide, please. Okay, so did the designers know about this? Well, actually, the authors of the book Dynamic Landscape, James Hitchmo and Nigel Dunnett, did know. They knew that people did not appreciate the ecological aesthetic for individual, group, or cultural reasons, but they concluded it wasn't important because they have seen how they can change landscape students' tastes over the progress of their degree. And also English Nature are looking to try to encourage children who are currently not visiting parks at the moment to get close to nature. And all of this indicates that the idea is that people are thinking wrongly. People need to change their minds. And I see that this is a very clear representation of white privilege, centering white values and saying that other people should change to be more like us. Next slide, please. So what we've found actually is that people's decisions to use or not use open spaces are actually quite rational, and they depend on whether they see the space as being viable, likely to be healthful, or interesting. Next slide, please. Oh, I see you've put the poll up. Okay, well, so we can look at that now, but could we just wait for 1 second to have the poll? Is that okay, Christine?
Yeah, you could just carry on. People will just do it in the
background. Okay, well, so
yeah.
the graphic in the background there indicates how people who live in areas of parks with more than 40% residents from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic backgrounds have 11 times less green space when that's compared to areas where residents are largely white. So if you look back again at that statistic that indicated that Black children are not visiting green spaces, the fact that there aren't the green spaces available is surely an important part, and it is probably not that they need to be encouraged. It's probably that they need to have more green space. Another issue around viability is to do with dogs. So we're just going to go to the poll now, and I'm going to ask you, do you think that dogs should have more parks should have more dog-free areas, stronger requirements for dogs on leads, and dedicated no-lead dog run areas?
So we're just getting the numbers in. I'm going to close the poll in 2 seconds. We're at 200 and, ooh, it's going up fast. Okay, get your answer in. We're at 260, 275. Can we get 300? I sound like an auctioneer. Brilliant. The poll should have popped up for you, but if you can see on your Zoom control bar, is there something that says poll? It should, the window should have popped up, but I'm not sure. Someone's asking. You know what, Bridget, I would just, I'm going to close that down now.
Sure. Okay, so viability,
chance.
The reason I'm asking about dog-free areas, I think for some people who may not be aware of this, it's actually a really serious equalities issue under the protected characteristic of religion, because for many Muslims who cover, being touched by the mouth parts of a dog is actually not so much forbidden as actually considered dirty, and then you need to wash. You have to wash your clothes 7 times before you can pray. And so it's not about whether the dog's friendly, it's not about whether you're afraid of the dog. And these things can also happen for people. People can be afraid of dogs, and many people are, but there's actually a religious restriction, and therefore under the Equalities Act, there should be provision, equal provision for people for dog-free areas. Next.
So can you see those results, Bridget?
Yeah.
Do you want me to read them out? So there is 53% would like more dedicated no-lead dog run areas, 27% would like more dog-free areas, and 19% want stronger requirements for dogs on leads.
Okay, well that's okay. Quite a large number of people, and I would be surprised if the parks in your area actually even provide 27% of people who might think there should be more dog-free areas will not have them. So I think this is a really important thing for British park managers to reflect on. And in beaches, you know, you see that there's beach controls in the summer, so maybe there's some seasonality around that. Anyway, looking at why people say that they don't want to go to green spaces, we're looking here at dogs off leads and dog mess and dogs biting you are really significant, and they're actually a huge bar to the Bangladeshi people using Victoria Park. Next slide, please. Okay, so the next slide is around what's interesting. Christine, do you want to launch the next poll, or should we just keep moving? Okay, great. So this piece of the study now we're going to look at is some of the work that we did in Croydon, which is around the equalities impact assessment. So we looked at all of the different kinds of equalities issues across all the protected characteristics, and we're going to look at the results for race in Croydon with regard to what people find interesting. So we were asking people what takes them to the park most often, and they didn't have a list they were able to choose. So this list has actually been devised based on the responses that we got from the Croydon work. and we had 240 returns. Okay, next slide, please. And this is what we found for white participants who claimed a white ethnicity. And next slide, please. This is what we found for people claiming an Asian ethnicity. Next slide, please. And this is what we found for people who claimed very Black ethnicities. And next slide, please. Looking at those together, what you can see is that there's a huge variation in the ways that people think about what takes them to the park, and that these might be to do with legitimate tastes for the identity that they feel that they're a part of, for the groups that they wish to belong to, and also legitimate reasons to claim leisure time. So, you know, you're very busy, you're supposed to have responsibilities, etc. Actually going to the park can be something you feel you need to have a good reason to do. And people are actually publicly performing for the sort of visibility to other people of their own identity, their own sort of ethnic identity, cultural identity, subcultural identity. And the space then allows us to express, and also it will shape our shared values, because what's possible constrains the activities that people can do. And so what we're looking at here are group averages. They're not individual measures. Everybody has their own individual things that they do, but this is about sort of collective thinking. And the other thing across all of these is that actually people wanting to see wildlife was equal across all of the groups. So what we didn't find was that any particular group needed to be encouraged to think about nature more than anybody else. Okay.
So I put up the results there. It's a lot of people going for a walk. So
yeah. So everybody, a lot of people here are going for a walk. That's great. So I don't know how the makeup of the audience is reflected, and whether there's any kind of similarities for people looking at those patterns. Next slide, please.
But the second biggest one is greenery and connect with nature. So you might want to, that's 22%. So just behind going for a walk.
Yeah, yeah, they could well be lockdown influenced. I saw that pop up. Next slide, please. Okay, and then the final characteristic is whether the space is seen as healthful. And I'm sorry for the word that I've made up here, but this is trying to express the idea that people feel that when they go there, that it will be good for them. Next slide, please. Oh, and these are the things that people found put them off. So there was a poll. We were going to look at what would put you off going to the park. And certainly we've talked already about the presence of dogs, but also there are issues of fear. There's concern that there will be pests, dirt, that the space would be not hygienic. There's also some concern that a space might feel too artificial. So there's a variety of different things. And what we were asking people as well about the places that they would prefer, safety was the number one thing, feeling safe. And also looking for fresh air and greenery. So, you know, these things are common, they're shared, with getting a similar result. Next slide, please. Okay, so to conclude then, attractive, healthy nature is not one thing. People access, perceive, interact with, and value nature differently. Next slide, please. So to recommend, I think equality is not about treating everybody the same way. It's about recognizing and respecting diversity enough to adapt practice. As landscape professionals, in all aspects, whether we're teaching people, employing people, or making spaces, we need to have empathy and we need to value difference. We're not trying to educate. We are in teaching, obviously trying to educate, but not educate out. You have to watch your privilege and your cultural prejudice. Okay. We should be also routinely considering ethnic and religious makeup of the catchment of spaces. Census categories aren't perfect. As I've already said, I mean, Africa is hardly a single cultural entity, but they can offer a guide, and they can also help us to measure the space's appeal against equalities criteria. And when gathering information, include equalities measures that can allow for feedback. You have to be able to disaggregate it so that if there are patterns in people's preferences by age, by gender, by ethnicity, or other protected characteristics, then those concerns can be identified. If you just put all of the data together and you don't know who said what, you're not really catering to the, to the Equalities Act in the way that you should be. But also it's important that from our research, it's not all about the aesthetic. Access can be a key issue. How the space is framed, whether it feels cared for, it can still have, wildflowers, habitat and diversity value, as long as it doesn't look like it's neglected. And many people are more interested in the activities and in cleanliness and in safety than they are in what the space, exactly what the planting aesthetic is. Prioritizing dog use space is an equalities issue. We should be thinking about seasonal or timed or dog-free dog control exercise areas, including in country park spaces, because many people really would like to access those spaces, but they don't feel able to. And also pay to play is potentially an equalities issue. So because many people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds are hugely disadvantaged in terms of income, if you institute pay to play in your park, then you may be impacting them far more than other people. Okay, and next slide, please. Questions?
Brilliant. I'm going to end this poll just to kick off so that you can, I can share the results on the final poll. And I will stop sharing my screen at the same time so we can bring us back. Great. Thank you so much for that, Bridget. We've got lots of questions in here, some really brilliant ones. So first of all, have a look at the poll results. Is that commensurate with your research?
Can you scroll
down? Oh, yes, of course.
Okay.
I didn't know I had control, but
no, it's cool. I think I've managed to do it. Yeah. Well, I think that it's good to see that things like bad weather does discourage some people. That's actually a factor for a lot of people. Litter, dog mess, pests. Yep, those things are very much common across the piece. Fear of harm from other people. Found that particularly for women, but that there were differences in how afraid different ethnic backgrounds women were. And I also think that potentially how long someone's been in the neighborhood has a huge influence on whether or not you're afraid of people in the park, because you might often know them if you've been there a really long time. So there's a lot of things that kind of play into all of these factors. Okay, yeah.
Someone's just asked how many respondents, but each of the polls had about 300 responses. We have an audience of some, it varies between, I can only see concurrent viewers. So we've had as many as 370 to 380 taking part in the polls, but I think about 300 people have responded to each of them, or waited till we got over 300. So, but of course, this is representative of a placemaking community. So again, as Bridget said, our tastes as a group might be different, and they might not be. But again, there was a mention that I haven't done a kind of socio-ethnic poll or an ethnicity poll of our audience. So that would have been a really good one to put in with the rest of these, as has been said. Bridget, one of the questions that has been voted up is around the ecological aesthetics benefits, in terms of flood mitigation, in terms of biodiversity. You don't really address those benefits, which I guess we've been educated about. So how would you go about, without a kind of imposition of that, is it true that these ecological landscapes are better at these other things, or how do we balance out?
Well, I think if you go to France and you look in Paris, there's a range of really interesting approaches to biodiverse plant arrangements, which are also formal and incredibly varied. I think, my position is, as I've said in the recommendations, aesthetics isn't everything. One of the most used spaces in Burgess Park is the barbecue area. It's hugely diverse in the audience that use that space, and it's right beside a wildflower covered mound. And I think that actually it is to do with how spaces are framed and what activities are possible, and thinking about variety. But what I would also say is that expecting people who have not got the power to shape space to take the biodiversity value that white people now require because we've destroyed the world is pretty unfair. So that's a kind of something to think about in terms of the, I guess, the moral obligation to do that. I'm not suggesting that you wouldn't have any biodiversity value in your park, but I think that you can kind of look at where it goes, how it's framed, what you're doing with care. And as I say, I think a lot of it is not so much about aesthetics as it is about what's possible to do.
Yes, and there's a comment here from Shruti Guruswamy saying, in Stockholm, biodiversity and ecological landscapes don't have to look rural or farm-like. So I guess there's a question there, but what is taste and what is ecological? They're not necessarily the same thing. There's a question here about examples of park design that have enabled. You just mentioned Burgess Park. Are there other parks that you would suggest that people visit or look at that balance ecology and green spaces and diversity that are kind of exemplar?
Well, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's really difficult. I mean, I think that there are spaces that are close to where people live are always the ones that are easiest for them to access, and actually focusing our attention on ensuring that the spaces where people live are useful, beautiful to them, that there's investment in those spaces is one of the keys. And so, I mean, you mentioned at the beginning of the discussion, Van Gogh Walk in Stockwell, which is a playable street with a community garden in it and a range of different kinds of features, and that's incredibly diverse in its use patterns, the people that engage with it in a variety of ways. But I mean, I think if you're looking for a countryside space that's really diverse, or a country park space that's really diverse, the Dayfield at Epping Forest, where they have the barbecues, people can go up there and they come with one car, and then everybody else arrives on trains, and they're there for the whole day, and that field is full of all the different kinds of people from London, which is a real wonderful thing to see. And I think it is, as I say, it's often about thinking about hearing what people actually want to do in spaces, and then allowing that, or thinking how you can make the space do many different things, which is what designers are supposed to do.
There's a question here about who are the leading academic researchers and practitioners who are people of color who are also engaged in this area of research. How do you as a white researcher have, I don't know, check your privilege when you're doing this research? Or I think that question, does your education impact on the research itself?
Well, of course. I mean, I'm constantly trying to be reflexive, trying to think about things like, why is this view rational? How can I see this as what this person is saying as something that I can support? So that's one of the things that I'm always trying to do, rather than going, goodness me, isn't that person, don't they have terrible taste? I kind of like really strive to avoid that. I'm also really striving in my teaching to talk about, actually, the reason that we recommend using these techniques is because this will help you to sell your idea. It's not about, that what you're doing is bad taste. It's about understanding the field and what works within the field. And that's kind of the way that I'm trying to frame it. But I'm always trying to allow people to explore their own individual preferences and bring back their own background into what they're doing. I started the process of looking at white culture in my undergraduate degree because I was very interested in the use of landscapes in advertising. and why it was that there was much more use of big, wide, free spaces the richer you got, and why there wasn't this access to sort of, you know, like the big car adverts are always driving in some incredible, epic, empty landscape. And I was looking at like different magazines. So I would look at something like Closer or, you know, like even the Daily Mail, and look at what are the landscapes in those publications. So I was looking at hegemony even then. And I think that I became very aware that people did not like the same romantic imagery as maybe I might present when I first came to London, because one of the things that we do is show people images and say, you know, would you like it to look a bit like this? Would you like it to look a bit like that? And they'd go, oh, that's awful. Why would I want it to look like that? And I was like, oh, this is really new. I wasn't really, you know, until I'd lived in London and met lots of people with different cultural backgrounds, I hadn't really been familiar with that. And then looking at the research, there is a lot of research from the States, and a lot of the researchers are from Black and Puerto Rican backgrounds who are covering all of these things. And then Julian Agyeman is a British planner who's a Black guy who has gone to the States to look at environmental justice. So there are a range of Black researchers, but primarily in the US, and a lot of more Black landscape architects in the US than there are in the UK. I don't know if that's enough of an answer.
I think there's one other. I mean, I'm sure people can follow up and tweet you with some other questions as we're going through. There's a question here about the take up of place streets from Holly Weir. She's saying that the recent place streets movement tends to be taken up more by white middle class areas. Do you have a sense about of street play? And I mean, you mentioned that it was a play street scheme. Is there anything there?
I mean, I think that one of the reasons why middle class white people kind of engage with these things more is because they're used to being heard and they're used to their views being important. So they think there's a point to them doing that. And very often they have the energy and the time because they're not ground down by a range of other things going on in their lives. So I think if you didn't feel like anything you said was really ever going to be listened to, or that what you said was so far from what people wanted to hear, that they're just not going to do it, then I guess it would be less likely that you'd be putting yourself forward and going, I'm going to do this, I'm going to lead on this. So I think there's a kind of a way in which we expect people to be like us. We have our experiences. I mean, I have my experience as a middle-class white woman, and actually it's so easy to just think that everybody else's life is like that, or that everybody else's experience is like that. And that's what I'm saying, is you really have to stop thinking like that. You have to really put yourself into other people's positions, and ideally let other people come forward into the profession and lead on these things.
And I mean, and I think part of it might be around, do you have advice around when you're researching, when you're working on the context about approaching people and talking to people? Is it that open-mindedness? Is coming with pictures as you did, is that quite a useful tool to say which of these do you prefer? What tools have you found most effective?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a thing within our practice. We kind of don't have an attachment to a particular aesthetic. We're not specifically trying to create a landscape that looks like anything in particular. We're trying to hear what people want. And I think that we see using imagery as a shorthand to say it could be a bit like this, it could be a bit like that. Like, you want a planting area, you want more plants, you know, what do you think? Because there's some basic kind of differences, and well, there will be maintenance implications. But, you know, it's kind of how people can engage. Do you want plain wooden seats? Would you like brightly colored seats of different, you know, like what are the things that are important to you? And you're just kind of using images as a way to kind of get to that. That's just one of the techniques we use. But we've also done model making, and we've had people involved in making models and stuff. So
do you think the safety questions, there's a question here from Toyin Agbetu about the safety issue that people raised here too, about fear of other people. Where do you think that's coming from, that fear?
Well, I think it's pretty rational from what I've seen and the people that I've spoken to. I think areas which are where people potentially have low income, or where people are subject to racism, people can be really brutal to one another. There was a lot of discussion about people setting dogs on Muslim people, like literally setting dogs on them in parks. I mean, so this is an experience. I guess people talked about having their kids' bikes stolen. Sorry, I'm feeling a little bit emotional. I'll just calm down.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think these are horrific things that people are going through. So as you say, it's not an irrational fear. It's not about landscape. It's about actual. And do you think there's a call for increased park guardianship? Or...
Yeah, definitely. That was well, certainly the looking at the analysis that I did of the long talk with different focus groups. Muslim participants in particular didn't find the places that they wanted, because what they actually wanted was potentially sort of gardens that were free of dogs and that were, I guess, secured in some way, looked after, maybe had garden wardens, community gardeners. But they were very happy to go to Quorum's Fields, which is exactly that. You know, it's a play space, but there's not much opportunity for gardening, and you have to take a special journey. So I think thinking, as I was saying, about like local spaces where people live is kind of a really important thing. But a lot of people would like to be able to let their kids out of the house and would like to be able to see them playing in the streets. And car danger is another really significant factor in why people don't have their kids going outside on their own and have to take them to parks. And when you have to take your child to play somewhere, then they're going to get less opportunity than if they were able to just run out of the house as they wished.
Mm-hmm. You're getting huge love from the chat for caring and being authentic. So just so you, there's some sharing going on about experiences of dogs being set on children and on Black children in the park and other park users. So I think this is something that perhaps isn't. Do you feel that is adequately considered when we're looking at a landscape
Not in the
project?
least. I mean, for years there's been this discussion about how dogs in parks are a problem for people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic groups. Looking at that discussion around nature space, there's a kind of a total disregard. It's like, oh, well, you know, they should get over it. Like, what is that? I find that really hard.
Mm-hmm. I guess if we had to call or fight for something, or as a community come together and begin to push for certain policies, certainly dogs is something that's come up. Are there other things that you would encourage people to campaign and raise awareness about and educate about if they're teaching? We're going to have a huge range of different people who come to these events, from educators to planners to practitioners and to interested citizens. So what are we fighting for?
Well, I think the Black Lives Matter movement are doing a great job on helping us to understand what we should be fighting for, and I think we should be listening. I think it's a good idea to try to get out of your bubble. I think people have been advocating for that. So, you know, follow people on Twitter or on social media who you don't look like, who you maybe don't even necessarily like what they're saying, but just to try to understand a little bit more about views other than the ones that you hear from your similar fish in similar water. I think, you know, there's lots of opportunities to read and to kind of like think about colonialism for a start. That's another really good one. Actually owning up to the slave trade would be quite good. yeah, I don't know, lots of things.
Well, I think that just leaves me to thank you so much for sharing what has been a really fascinating talk, your research, also your frankness and openness, and your willingness to really take on what are almost, as you said, accepted and perceived norms in design, and actually showing them for to be matters of taste and choice. And I think that opens up our it certainly has opened my eyes to decisions or even attitudes that I carry with me that I may or may not be aware of. So thank you so much for that.